So I'm going to take a moment, just one little moment, to do a personal thank you to Mike Medavoy. Mike's been an enormous influence in the industry for decades now, as an agent, an executive, CEO, and a producer. And he continues to stay active. And there's certain things I've never thanked you for, and I want to do that. One was when he was an agent, he represented Gene Wilder, who later in Gene's career, I was his partner for the last 10 years of basically of his career. And it's Mike Medavoy is the person who actually said to Gene he should be writing and directing. So that's the reason I even exist. So thank you, Mike, for that.
Thank you.
I also want to say thank you for being on this campus and coming here, but as an executive for everything that you've done for the industry. And my first movie was made with you as president of production, so thanks for your support on that too. Those are my personal thanks to Mike, and I've never said it to him before, so I'm going to do it here in public. But we're here to discuss United Artists and your trajectory from having worked with Arthur Krim and Eric Pleskow at United Artists. And just very briefly, I'm sure if all of you have been to any of the others, you've heard that United Artists started in the 20s with, you want to talk a little bit about that history? Or?
Well, a lot of you know, or may not know, that it was started by Charlie Chaplin, Doug Fairbanks, Mary Pickford. And essentially it was because what they wanted was their own distribution company. And it's basically set up as a distribution apparatus for their own films at first. And then finding others who needed distribution. So it was basically not really a production company, but rather a distribution apparatus. Which in some ways, the follow-up company, which was United Artists, which is in the 1950s, prided itself in also being a distribution company, but rather funding filmmakers and companies that could actually make movies with and using the United Artists distribution apparatus. So it was a different mindset because the other companies are basically production distribution apparatuses. They were more involved in the making of the films. If you look at MGM, for example, and you think about the number of people who worked there to build that apparatus, you know, whether it was in the music department or in any other department for that matter, or the production. Thalberg, for example, was really actually almost, you know, more a producer, somebody who got involved in every aspect of making a movie. That wasn't true at United Artists, although they did make deals with the Marish Company. And the Marishes provided a number of pictures, and they basically produced those movies for United Artists distribution. I learned that early in my entry into UA. I was working, my first job was in the mailroom at Universal Studios. And I was pretty sure that I was going to make it through. I don't know why, because thinking back at it, I think it was not the smartest idea I ever came up with. And I walked into the mailroom after I'd gone there thinking I was going to go into the international division. For those of you who don't know my background, I was born in China of Russian Jewish parents and lived there during World War II. The Japanese allowed the Jews to continue to exist, in large part because it was Jewish bankers during the 1905 war against Russia that provided the financing for the Japanese Navy to build up. And of course the Japanese won the naval battle. And as a result of it, they weren't going to disturb the Jews during the war. They did pretty much at the end. They started changing a little bit, changing their tune. And so my parents lived there from 1926 through 1940, almost 1948, and then we went to Chile for 10 years. And I lived in Chile for 10 years, went to school there, obviously learned the language. At the house, the original language was, it started off with Chinese and Russian, some Yiddish, but not a lot, and then Spanish. And as a result of speaking Spanish, I was able to, I wouldn't say master, but speak enough French and Italian. And I figured I'd get a job in the international division, but that didn't happen. And so when I went back to see the guy, and he said, you know, the only job we've got open is in the mailroom, I said, I'll take it. Now, I didn't know that when I decided to make that decision, that the other people who were in the mailroom were also, you know, had degrees in English or other. They had all gone to the universities. As a matter of fact, some of them had a master's degree. There was one guy with a PhD, and here I was with a BA in history and political science, having gone to law school for a year and a half. And I thought, you know, I'm going to make it right through. Of course, it took me about 6 months before I became a casting director as a trainee, and I went from casting director. I worked on Dragnet in the Bob Hope Chrysler Theater. Strangely enough, I became Bob Hope's agent pretty much at the end of his career, at the end of my career as an agent. And that, you know, that move was kind of interesting, because I decided one day I didn't want to be in the mail. I didn't want to be a casting director. I wanted to become an agent. Agents used to come and see me about their clients wanting jobs, and I thought, you know, that sounds pretty interesting. So I went to tell Jack Webb that I was moving out. He said, no. He said, you should stay. You got a career here. You know, you got to do well. Let me call Wasserman and tell him you know, set up a meeting. So I went over to see Wasserman, having made up my mind that I was leaving and I was going to go be an agent. He had been an agent, a very successful one, so he would understand that. And he said, well, you know, Jack tells me you're great, and I'm sure you are. Would you be interested in, what job would you like here? I said, well, the only job I want is one you're not going to give me. And he said, what's that? And I said, yours. And he said, you know, you're going to be a good agent. Which was, I guess, the exit door. And that's, so I started off being an agent. I learned quickly that the thing what I should represent is not so much actors, because I worked with actors for about 6 months. 6 months to a year. And they're all old actors who many of you probably remember by seeing, but not really knowing their names. But there was Van Heflin and Lloyd Nolan and Keenan Wynn, and it had Carol Burnett was part of the group. Somebody said to me, you know, you ought to be representing writers and directors. So I said, that sounds like a good idea. I'm looking at Time magazine one day, and at USC, they had a bunch of kids that were graduating that seemed to have done some interesting stuff. So I asked my secretary to see if she could find them. And sure enough, she found this guy by the name of John Milius, and I called him up, signed him up. He brought a fellow they had done a movie with by the name of George Lucas. So he walked in. So there I was with Lucas, and then Spielberg, signed Spielberg real quickly. After I saw a short. And I would say within 3 or 4 years, I represented most of the young filmmakers coming up in the business. I mean, there was Hal Ashby, there was Terrence Malick, you name it, one after another, and a bunch of foreign filmmakers too. I represented 3 great British directors, Tony Richardson, Lindsay Anderson, Carol Rice, and a bunch of Italians who became my friends. And pretty much by the end of 1970, You know, I had a pretty much of a hold on a lot of young filmmakers and writers. A lot of great writers, some of whom were older. And I started attracting, interestingly enough, a lot of the really interesting, you know, writers that wanted to be represented by somebody that was younger. That was me at the time. And then in '74, I went to, between '72 and '74, I set up 3 movies working at Marvin Josephson's place, one of which was a movie that Susan was involved with, Young Frankenstein. One was Jaws, and one was the Redford Newman movie,
Sting.
The Sting, yeah. So that was all learned at the agency business. I learned through the agency business. I learned how to put packages together, and that's probably why I was offered the job at UA.
So this was 1974 when you got offered this job. So when Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford decided to let go of United Artists, they brought in Arthur Krim and Robert Benjamin, who eventually owned most of the company at this point. And Arthur Krim and Eric Plaistow, 2 of the most amazing men in our industry as well, were now running United Artists at this time. And was it Eric that called you, or?
Yeah, Eric Plaistow called me and said, you know, there are a couple of your clients that I'd like to make deals with. And I said, who are they? And he looked at me and he said, Michael Crichton and Raquel Welch. And I looked at him and I was taking pity of him. And I said, I'm going to be a really good guy with you. You got to explain the Raquel Welch thing to me, because that makes no sense. And he said, well, you know, she can star in movies for us. And I said, look, Michael Crichton's a great idea. You know, not only is he a doctor, but he's a great writer, and he's, you know, he'll bring some great stuff to you. But I think the Raquel Welch thing is not as good an idea. And of course, I represented Raquel Welch, so it was rather a difficult conversation to have. 2 days later, he called me up and he said, you know, I want to offer you a job as the head of production at United Artists. Would you consider doing something like that? And I said, of course I would, yeah. So in 1971 or 2, I can't remember what it was. No, it was 72, I think it was. I got a call from Marvin Josephson that ran the agency, and he said, you know, I'd like you to, Kirk Douglas is looking for an agent. He, you know, he'd like to meet with you. And I said, I looked at him and I said, listen, Marvin, I don't want to represent Kirk Douglas. It's just not, you know, I don't want to go through what I watched him, you know, work through Freddie Fields, who I went at the previous agency that had worked. You know, I saw Freddie whenever I left the office at 7:30. Freddie was on the phone with Kirk Douglas, and I knew that conversation took place till 8:30, 9 o'clock, and usually Kirk was berating him. And I said, I don't want to go through that. And of course, by then I had set up those 3 big movies, so he wasn't looking at me like I was crazy. He finally convinced me to go see him, and I went over to see Kirk, and I had a wonderful conversation with him. I thought, you know what? I'm wrong. I can handle this guy, and I'll know how to hang up at 7:30. And I waited like 2 weeks. I didn't hear from him. I figured, you know, nothing was going to happen. I then got a call from Kirk, and it was a very nice conversation. He said, look, I've decided to go with Stan Kamen at the Morris office, primarily because I don't think you're going to be an agent very long. I think you're going to run a studio. And I didn't laugh, but I thought about laughing. And he was right. I was offered a job. But he said, I signed with Stan, but I told him there was one project that I'd like you to represent that I did off Broadway. It was called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I want to star in that movie and see if you can set it up. And I thought, yeah, thanks a lot. You know, I'm going to go set up a movie for Kirk Douglas called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In today's world, that's not going to happen. And sure enough, it was, I guess, 2 years later that he had given it to Michael Douglas, and Michael had found Saul Zaentz, and then instead of putting his father in it, put Jack Nicholson in it, and they apparently didn't speak for a year. But I didn't, you know, and the way it happened was I got a phone call one day from Arthur Krim about 6 months into my job. I hadn't started a movie. And what I was about to start wasn't very good, as a matter of fact. I do remember that. And then he said, you know, I need you to come to New York. I said, okay. So I went to New York. He said, what the hell are you doing out there? I said, oh, I'm trying to find movies. You know, I'm waiting for Warren Beatty. I mean, waiting for Warren Beatty. I should have known better by then, but, you know, it was not the smartest thing I could have done. He said, how many people do you think work in this building? I said, I have no idea. He said, about 329 people, and if you don't start a movie, they're all going to be out of a job. That was the distribution business. He said, you know, we're a distribution company. Go back to LA. I said, okay, I'll leave tomorrow and I'll see if I can find something to do. He said, why wait till tomorrow? Get on the plane tonight. Sure enough, I got on the plane, got to my office, and on my desk was the script, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I read it, spoke to a colleague of mine, then Marcia Nassiter, who was the first woman vice president in the studios. And we both agreed it was really good, and so I sent it to Arthur and said, okay, this is it. I want this one. This is the one I want to do. So it took a long time to make the deal because Saul Zaentz was not an easy kind of guy to make a deal with. He had tax money, which had paid for whatever it was that got him started on. And so I got lucky.
So you started One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and you went on to make a lot of movies in the next few years, some amazing films. And at a certain point, Arthur Krim and Eric Pleskow were looking to leave, and they asked you to join them. So you're at UA at the time, and you decided to make the move with them to go and start Orion. But before you leave, there's a movie sitting on your desk called Raging Bull, which we're about to see.
Yes.
You want to tell them the story of how that got made?
Well, we had a deal with Winkler and Chartoff, which basically a production deal, and I think that the pattern of that one was pretty much, you know, the Marishes had already left and had gone when I came to UA, they had already gone to Universal, and so we brought a couple of production companies, one of which was Winkler and Chartoff, which we had done Rocky with in New York. And they had this one, Raging Bull. And, you know, we were all, it was a kind of a strange way because there's no question in my mind that Transamerica, the insurance company that actually had bought United Artists, you know, they felt that Arthur was too old, that he'd gotten too old to be in the business. And they called Eric up and said, Eric, you know, we'd like to just finish up with Arthur and you run the company. And Eric didn't want to do that. He said, look, if you're getting rid of Arthur, you're getting rid of me too. So that was that. Then, so Eric asked me to come to New York and we talked for a bit, and he just said, you know, why don't we, you know, are you interested in starting a company with us? You know, just Bob Benjamin, who was Arthur's partner, who was the other side of Bob, it was the other side of Arthur. Both of them were really interesting guys, had, you know, great political savvy, you know, they'd been friends with Kennedy and Matter of fact, that picture that you see of Marilyn Monroe and John Kennedy at a party was at Arthur's house. And then he said, you know, we're thinking of starting it. You know, will you come with us? And I said, absolutely. So I went to meet the Transamerica people, and at the meeting, Bill Bernstein was also there. I said, I don't know about you, Bill, but you know, after listening to Transamerica people, I've decided to leave. And so I said, you know, thank you so much, and I moved out. And as I went to the bathroom at United Artists, and Eric was there, and we had a meeting actually at Eric's apartment in Santa Monica about Raging Bull, and he said, you know, I'm thinking that we ought to do that movie. So in the bathroom, he says, you know, I greenlit the movie, so this movie's going to start, despite the fact that we're going to be leaving. So that's basically it. Yeah.
So they were making two movies at the time. One was Heaven's Gate, and one was Raging Bull.
Well,
and
they weren't making Heaven's Gate, because Heaven's Gate came to us under a different title. It was called Johnson County War, and we'd already turned it down a couple of times, as a matter of fact. No disrespect to Heaven's Gate or Michael Cimino, because it was not a script that we wanted to do. I mean, doing a Western at that point made no sense for us. Doing it with Michael Cimino, the first movie that I presided over was a movie that had been already finished by Michael Cimino and done at United Artists. As I was coming in, that movie had been finished. It was with Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges. And I had a conversation with the agent, Michael Cimino's agent, just as I was coming in, and he said, you know, you should think of Michael Cimino as David Lean. And I thought to myself, you know, either this guy's smoking some really funny cigarettes or on drugs. And then, you know, I figured that it was not only him, it was not only the agent that had that attitude, but I thought Michael Cimino had the same attitude. And, you know, if he really thought of himself as David Lean, you know, after that movie, I thought, you know, there's no winning here. I'm not gonna win an argument. So we'd already turned it down, and it was offered to us again, actually, when Orion started. So the answer is no. We weren't going to do that movie.
But Raging Bull went forward, and you guys left at that point to start Orion Pictures.
That's correct.
So you're about to see Raging Bull, and I you know, before that happens, just one reference on this movie is that it was shot by Michael Chapman, who actually taught at UNCSA for about 3 or 4 years, and he described it in a really interesting way as that they shot the film as if it were an opera, and that the fight scenes that you're about to see are the arias. And that seems and feels right. It feels like, you know, it makes sense for this movie. And obviously this was a movie that was of great passion for De Niro and became a passionate project for Martin Scorsese, even though De Niro had to drag him into it.
Well, there was, you know, it was interesting to do another boxing movie. You know, Rocky was a huge success for us when we least expected it, actually. It was a script that I read on an airplane, and got off the plane and thought, wow, this could be a really good movie. But no boxing movie at that point had done any money. They'd been good, but they hadn't made any money. So the company decided to, I mean, there are lots of wonderful stories about the making of Rocky and the release of Rocky and distribution of it. But one of them was that it was, you know, a boxing movie in which the leading guy loses the fight at the end, which most people don't remember, or a lot of people don't know that he lost it. It's he's an unknown. I mean, there's one reason after another as to why not to make the movie. And when we made the deal, since it was Winkler and Chartoff and they couldn't do the movie without our permission, we crossed what we thought was the big movie that Winkler and Chartoff was doing at the time, crossed the profits of New York, which we thought was going to make a lot of money, with what we thought could be a very modest loss on Rocky.
Well, I want to thank you. I really appreciate you coming here and getting stuck in the weather here, Rob.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.